of Peru were home to the most advanced civilizations of South America. The Inca Empire was the last of many to rise and fall in Peru, but it was the greatest. The Inca were the Romans of the New World. Incomparable builders and engineers, they created Machu Picchu, the most sophisticated road system of the Americas, and countless masterpieces of gold. But their real genius was for conquest. In the 15th century, they used it to conquer the entire Andean region. The ghosts of that fierce Inca empire still haunt Peru's modern capital, Lima. The 21st century Lima is a teeming city of 9 million. But beneath its sprawling shanty towns lie layer upon layer of Peru's ancient dead. For over 20 years, Peruvian archaeologist and National Geographic grantee Guillermo Koch has been working to unravel the mysteries of these Indian grave sites. Nobody knows more about the ancient burials of Lima.
Límpialo con la brocha nomás, eso es lo que hay que limpiar con la brocha. Con la escobilla, con esa.
At the beginning of March of 2004, the city was going to open a new highway in the area that we suspected that had a cemetery. Now we decided to put a trench in order to test if was or wasn't a cemetery.
The site Guillermo was investigating was an apparently unremarkable hillside in a suburb of Lima called Puruchuco. He set to work with his colleague of many years, archaeologist Elena Goicoechea.
Hola, Willy.
Hola, Elena, ¿cómo estás?
Very quickly, their test trench yielded results.
The result of the test was about 20 graves in a trench that was 2 by 8 meters. That finding led us to conclude that little ravine was in fact a cemetery.
At first, the Puruchuco graveyard seemed very similar to others Willie and Elena had excavated. Bodies were buried at regular intervals in a crouched sitting position facing the rising sun. This is the classic pattern of Inca burials. But before long, strange anomalies began to appear.
Very soon, when we were into the excavation, we noticed that there was a number of individuals that they didn't conform to the standard, to the what we may call the burial pattern.
In the lower layers of the cemetery, everything seemed to be as Willie would expect in a well-organized Inca graveyard. But on top of these was a layer of bodies buried near the surface, which was like nothing he or Elena had ever seen.
The body is stretched out this way, facing west. Normally, it should be facing that direction, east. The orientation is all wrong, just like the others.
The more they uncovered, the more surprises they found. On top of the corpses of the traditional Inca graveyard, bodies had been thrown in chaotically. Instead of the usual careful wrapping of the body with cotton stuffing and woolen fabrics, these had been hastily wrapped in simple cloths called telas. They were stretched on their side or back, some faced up, some to the west. None were crouched and facing east in the traditional Inca way.
It was evident that they didn't follow the burial ritual. They were without the proper offerings. Now the question is why these individuals have been buried in such an unusual way.
To someone who knows the Inca world as well as Willie and Elena, this was mystifying. Reverence for the dead was at the core of Inca culture. Properly performed death rituals were crucial to ensuring the rebirth of the dead in the spirit world. Hence, their burial in a crouched, expectant pose facing the sunrise, symbol of rebirth. Against this backdrop, the treatment of the bodies at Puruchuco was doubly surprising.
It's as if the moment they died, they just wrapped them in a cloth, brought them to the cemetery, and stuck them in the ground chaotically, not the usual Inca way.
When Willie and his team unwrapped the loosely covered skeletons, what they found was even more shocking. Almost all bore marks of extreme violence. Skulls had been crushed, and some showed injuries that had never been seen before in an Inca cemetery. In fact, in any Indian cemetery anywhere in Central or South America. One skeleton in particular really caught their attention. They called him Mochito, the severed one, because of his horrific injuries.
The left middle and ring finger on the left hand have been perhaps cut off or twisted off. He's clearly received some sort of blow to the face, a perimortem fracture to the left first rib, a pretty bad break to the proximal femur. All of these injuries together lead me to believe that this individual died a very violent death.
Melissa Murphy is a bioarchaeologist working with Willie to interpret Mochito's injuries.
This is a very exceptional skeleton for a number of reasons. He's very atypical. He has a series of perimortem injuries that I haven't encountered before, in particular, these 3 quadrangular defects to his cranium. One of the defects also has a small radiating fracture, hinging fracture, that it looks like something caught the outer table of this bone. I've never encountered this, and based on documented cases of other injuries, it seems consistent with metal-edged weaponry. You know, something else, but not something you would see among Inca weapons.
The Inca had few weapons capable of delivering the clean, piercing wounds Melissa sees in Mochito's remains. Their deadliest weapons of war were stone clubs, spears, and slings. The type of weaponry used by Inca warriors had been obsolete in Europe for over 2,000 years.
The Inca army would have been totally beyond the comprehension or historical memory of the Spaniards. It's a Chalcolithic army, meaning that the Andeans could smelt gold, silver, copper, but all of their cutting implements, all of their piercing implements, all their weapons were stone.
The arrival of Pizarro and his conquistadors in 1532 brought this Inca army and its stone weapons face to face with 16th century Europe's most advanced military technology. It was only 40 years since Christopher Columbus had claimed his first discoveries in the New World for Spain. Since then, indigenous populations of the Americas had been overwhelmed by the relentless Spanish expansion. One reason for that was that the Spanish brought with them 2 things the Indians had never seen before.
The Spanish had enormous advantages of mobility. Their horse was perhaps the second largest advantage they had. The greatest advantage was their possession of steel weapons.
The strange wounds on the top of Mochito's skull made Willie and his team think of stab wounds delivered from horseback. Could the bodies in the graveyard be victims of Pizarro's conquistadors? If so, they would be the first ever found. The injury to another skull seemed to prove the link to the conquistadors in an even more dramatic way.
What's especially anomalous about it is that it has a large circular defect on the left parietal that looks suspiciously like a gunshot wound. And it looks like as the projectile exited the face and exited this area, it came apart and the entire face was fragmented. What's especially exceptional about this is not only that we have, in fact, the entrance wound and the exit wound that I just showed you, but also that I recovered the plug of bone that actually was in this position on the inside of the skull.
This could be a momentous discovery. It would be the first documented gunshot wound in the New World. The primitive but deadly 16th century guns called arquebuses were just one of the many terrifying novelties the Spanish brought with them to South America.
The Spanish arquebuses of the conquest were no more awkward than European infantry muskets 100 years later, a bit heavier for the projectile weight, but the Spaniards knew how to use them. They knew how to use them well.
The combination of guns, steel weapons, and cavalry had a devastating effect on native armies. The Inca had no defense against any of them.
The European response to a cavalry charge had been learned over centuries of exposure to mounted combat. Over the short term, the Inca had no response whatsoever to cavalry.
And there was yet another deadly cargo brought by the Spanish which would eventually decimate the Inca population: disease. But no one is sure exactly when the first epidemics arrived, so Willie's team concentrate their efforts on the more obvious injuries to the skeletons. If the suspected gunshot wound is real, it would be unprecedented. So Melissa needs proof. She hopes that X-rays might reveal traces of metal around the edges of the wound.
Here we're seeing really where the exit wound was, and we were really expecting to see metal residues, really bright white that's distinct from the bone and the teeth in the film. But we don't, there's nothing in there that suggests that there's lead or lead residues. Looks like no.
The negative result is a blow. To Melissa and Willie, the wound clearly suggests a gunshot. They just can't prove it. Perhaps the metal traces left by the musket ball were too minuscule for the X-rays to detect. So Willie decides on a bold course of action. He calls on one of the world's foremost crime labs. It is 4,000 miles away at the University of New Haven in Connecticut. With cutting-edge forensic techniques, if any place can get some results from the skeletons of Puruchuco, it is here. Top forensic scientists Al Harper and Tim Palmbach have examined hundreds of gunshot wounds, a lot fresher than the one in Peru. Before long, Al and Tim are in Lima. The lure of examining what may be the first gunshot wound in the Americas is irresistible.
Dr. Koch?
Hi.
Good morning.
Welcome to our lab.
Albert Harper, how are you?
Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
Lab, no? Let's come in.
Very interesting.
Willie's lab contains the remains of over 3,000 Inca burials. Work on this astonishing collection of mummies and skeletons has been temporarily abandoned as